And I've named this talk From Eunice to Amanda because those two women bookend the first section of my talk. So I want to pay tribute to some really remarkable women. I'm only going to talk about 9 because they've only given me 25 minutes. Otherwise, I'd be talking about hundreds, if not thousands, because, of course, many of the women that I would like to talk about are actually here in this audience. Okay, so this is what I want to cover today. I want to talk about these 9 outstanding women, all of whom have made incredible contributions to our understanding and communication and action about climate change. I then want to talk about why their work is so important, which is really just a little excuse to tell you about climate change. And then I'm going to end with some personal reflections from me as a woman who's worked in conservation science and climate change science for a long time about where we are and where I think we need to go. Okay, now unfortunately, and you'll see why in a minute, I have to introduce my 9 women by a picture of a man. It's not Abraham Lincoln. It's actually a guy called John Tyndall. He's a very famous Irish physicist who was generally, until about 2 years ago, credited with doing the first experimental work to demonstrate the greenhouse effect. He published his work in 1859. But he didn't discover it, I mean. In fact, the first work, and we've only realised this in 2016, done on the greenhouse effect was done by a woman called Eunice Newton Foote, who actually published her work in 1856, 3 years before John Tyndall. She did a whole lot of really, really elegant experiments, putting gases into jars, heating the jars up in the sun, and measuring the heat-trapping properties of different gases. And she said this: the highest effects of the sun's rays were from carbonic acid gas. Now, these days, we know that carbonic acid gas is actually carbon dioxide. Unfortunately for Eunice, this work was presented to the American Academy for Sciences, and women weren't allowed to be members at that stage. And in fact, they weren't even allowed to present their work, so her work was read to the Academy by a man. He did attribute the work to her, however. But the really remarkable thing about Eunice was that not only did she do the experiments, but she actually realised their significance. She actually wrote, it was only a 2-page paper, she said, if there's more of this carbonic acid gas going into the atmosphere, the world will warm up. This was back in 1856. A truly prescient and remarkable woman. Oh, and the fact that we don't have any photos of her, I should say, which is somewhat symbolic of the fact that her work was forgotten for so long. So here's some more of the women that I just want to very briefly point out. You'll have all, I think, remember Sharon Burrow. She's still with us, former head of the ACTU here in Australia, now the head of the International Trade Union Confederation, which represents 176 million workers across the world. And what Sharon has been doing is making the point that it's not, unlike some of our politicians, it's not a matter of environment or jobs, it's environment and jobs. And I think we can attribute that phrase, no jobs on a dead planet, to Sharon Burrow. One of my personal scientific heroes is Corinne Lequer. She's now the director of the Tyndall Centre of Climate Change Research, named after that famous John Tyndall. It should be really called the Foote Centre, I think, for Climate Change Research. Corinne's work has been on the carbon budget, and I'll tell you a little bit about the carbon budget later and why it's such an important concept for us to understand where we're going with climate change. Naomi Oreskes, many of you I think have probably read this book, Merchants of Doubt. I think Oreskes really changed the way we think about climate skeptics, climate denialists. She painted a picture of conspiracy. If you're into conspiracy theories, this is a really good book to read. But she drew parallels between climate skepticism and the amount of money that goes into that way of thinking with other things like big tobacco. I think she changed the way we think about climate change and climate change communication. I now want to very briefly mention 3 extraordinary climate change negotiators. The first, Connie Hedegaard, Danish politician, now the head of the European Climate Commission. She actually ran the 2009 Copenhagen meeting on climate change. Many people regard that meeting as somewhat of a disappointment because there was no binding agreement that came out of that meeting. However, it set the stage for the Paris Agreement some years later, and Connie Hedegaard should take a great deal of credit for that. And then the next 2. This picture is from that final enthusiastic banging of the gavel at the Paris Climate Agreement. The French Foreign Minister, Laurent Fabius, actually banged the gavel and then everybody celebrated. And I want to point out those 2 women there, because without them, we would not have a Paris Climate Agreement at all. This is Christiana Figueres. She's a Costa Rican diplomat. Until 2016, she was the head of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Some of you may have heard of Figueres. She's been here visiting recently. I suspect that very few of you have heard of this woman, Laurence Toubiana. She was the chief French negotiator. Without her, we would not, I believe, have a climate agreement at all. An extraordinary diplomat, an extraordinary negotiator. And finally, my last 2 women are a bit closer to home. I want to talk about Anna Rose and Amanda Mackenzie, 2 good friends and colleagues of mine. Often people say to me, well, look, what can I do about climate change? I'm really frustrated, but I'm only one person. Well, they were only 2 people in 2006 when they founded the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. It now has 150,000 members. They've both been kicked out of it now because once you get to 30, they say, thank you very much, go away. So they're not allowed to be members anymore. But what they started and what they continue to support has been quite extraordinary. Anna has done many other things as well, including being the National Manager for Earth Hour for some years, and now works with the Climbers for Climate Action as their Strategic Partners Director. And then finally, Amanda. I'm sure many of you know Amanda or know of her. I had wanted her to be my guest here today, but about 10 days ago she had her first child, baby Matilda, who's doing well, so she sends her apologies. Without Amanda, we wouldn't have a Climate Council. Amanda was the Communications Director for the Climate Commission. When we knew we would be abolished some time before the election, she said, we've got to keep going. We said, yes, we've got to keep going. She said, I'm going to write a business plan to keep going. So she, in her part-time, she wrote a business plan, which basically formed the basis for the Climate Council. 4.5 years later, the Climate Council is still going. We've gone from 0 to 23 staff. We have offices here in Melbourne and also in Sydney, and we're about to publish our 100th report. So by all measures, I think Amanda's plan worked really well. She's a role model of mine, and I know role models generally are people that are older than yourself, and obviously she's not older than me, but I absolutely look up to her because I cannot think of any other person with more passion and more determination for this cause than Amanda. Okay, so they're my 9 women, very briefly. I want to talk now briefly also about why their work is so important, and I want to give you a warning because I'm going to tell you some fairly shocking and fairly depressing things in the next few minutes, but I hope to bring you up out of that trough of despair at the end of the talk. I'll let this little graphic run. That little wiggly line shows global temperatures going from the mid-1800s to 2016, and you can see that line inexorably getting closer and closer to the 1.5 degree and then 2 degree mark. That's where we are about now. And this global warming is having enormous consequences for the Earth. Climate change is not a future problem, it's a now problem. Our glaciers are retreating. Here's just one example, the Muir Glacier in Alaska. And it's a shame for tourists that are going to see glaciers, but the real problem of glacier retreat is that 1/6 of the world's population relies on glaciers for their water supply. They are retreating very rapidly. Many of them have disappeared altogether. Imagine if 1/6 of the world's population runs out of water. Polar ice is melting. This picture shows the Arctic summer ice between 1984 and 2016. You can see the impact. And just last week, we were treated to this image in some of our newspapers. This image keeps me awake at night. This year, in the last couple of weeks, the Arctic has been measured at between 25 and 30 degrees above what it should be at this time of the year. 25 to 30 degrees. No one can really believe that. Sea level rise is accelerating. In fact, it has tripled in its rate just since 1990. The oceans are 30% more acidic than they were in pre-industrial times, and this is already having impacts on marine life because many marine organisms need calcium ions to make their skeletons. Ocean acidification is affecting the availability of calcium in the ocean. Our coral reefs are actually starting to dissolve in acid from their base. And speaking of coral reefs, they are also, of course, bleaching, and I'm sure everybody in this room is aware of that. Over the last 2 years, the Great Barrier Reef and other reefs around the world have suffered their most catastrophic bleaching ever, 2 years in a row. This picture here was taken on Heron Island last year. 93% of the individual reefs on the Great Barrier Reef have been bleached, and now we know from surveys that about 50% of the coral that has bleached has now died. And on land as well, our ecosystems are transforming. This little montage here is not an actual transformation, it's a potential transformation. The picture on the left is the World Heritage Wet Tropics rainforests up in Cairns. The picture on the right is the vegetation around Jabiru in the Northern Territory. Some of my CSIRO colleagues have modelled the climate in Cairns with 4 degrees of warming, and what they get is Jabiru. Now, you do not need to be an ecologist like me or the other ecologists in this room to understand the impact on biodiversity of that type of ecological transformation. And it's not just species, of course, it's people too. People are dying in heat waves. In 2003 in Europe, there was a 3-week heat wave. 70,000 premature deaths occurred over that 3-week period. In Russia, 2010, 56,000 premature deaths. Now, luckily here in Australia, we haven't had those sorts of impacts, but there's nobody in this room that won't remember Black Saturday, February 2009, where 173 people lost their lives. But maybe many of you are not aware that in the week before Black Saturday, double that number of people died as a result of heat stress in southeast Australia. We do lose people in heat waves in this country. Some scientists at a conference last week were pondering the need for a Category 6 designation for tropical cyclones because Category 5 doesn't seem to be enough anymore. So heads up, we may soon get a Category 6. The water cycle is intensifying. Wet places are getting wetter generally, dry places are getting drier. This is a picture of Brisbane, by the way, in 2011. Most of us will remember those pictures. But this is Cape Town now. This is the dam that supplies Cape Town with water. Their day zero has now been designated as July 9, and if they don't get much rain between now and July 9, most of the taps in Cape Town will be turned off. Imagine a city like this if most of our taps got turned off. 2007 to 2016, there was nearly a 50% increase in weather-related disasters. 2015, 19 million people displaced due to those disasters. So I told you it'd be a bit depressing, sorry, but you know, that's just the way it is. So let's look at where we're going now. The Paris Climate Agreement was a watershed moment. It has some pretty significant aspirational targets, the aim being to keep temperatures globally to below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with an even more ambitious target to keep them below 1.5 degrees. How are we going? Well, I'm afraid not too well so far. It's great to have a target and an aspiration, but if you add together all of the pledges that those 195 parties that came to Paris for emissions reduction, if you add those together and assume that they will be delivered 100% and on time, we still get about 3 degrees of warming. Not enough so far. I mentioned the carbon budget before. Let me explain it very briefly. It's the amount of carbon we can put into the atmosphere for a certain outcome, a certain temperature. The best figures come from 2015, where it was calculated that to keep to 2 degrees, we've already emitted about 70% of the carbon that we can afford to emit. And at that present day rate of emissions, we have about 20 years left. To keep to 1.5 degrees, we've spent in 2015 95% of the allowable carbon budget. And that's 3 years left of emissions. So you can add 3 years to 2015, and here we are in 2018. There is absolutely no way we can keep to 1.5. We've got to keep working on the 2 and hope we overshoot and come back. Unfortunately, after a 3-year flatlining between 2014 and 2016 of global emissions, last year emissions went up 2%. Which leads me to this concept, unburnable coal. About 90% of all of the fossil fuel reserves, oil, coal and gas, that we know about must be left in the ground, undug up, unsold, unburnt, for us to have a 2/3 chance of staying beneath 2 degrees. Unburnable coal is actually a very, very important concept, and we've been hearing a lot in years about Adani. It's not just, of course, about Adani. I think I'll go on record as saying I think Adani is finished, but there's an awful lot of other coal mines that we then have to turn our attention to. So I hope to bring you up a bit now after all of that depression. It's early in the morning to get so depressed. So I want to just briefly talk to you about some things that I've learnt over the last few years in talking to people and working in this area. Sometimes it feels like this. And it feels like this because anybody that does any sort of communication about climate science is walking a tightrope. On the one hand, we do need to be honest and talk about some of the things that I've just depressed you about, the real risks of what is happening and could happen to this planet. But we also know that if we only talk about those risks, we do run the risk of turning people off. Nobody wants to think about those things all the time. I certainly don't. So we also need to talk about the positives, and there are plenty of positives, and I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples in a moment. And it's balancing between the negatives and the positives that creates the challenge for any of us in this communication space. So here's what I've learnt. Scientists love getting data. We produce it, we graph it, we put it into IPCC reports that are about 800 pages long that nobody actually reads. That little graph that says N equals 294,000, that's the number of papers written about climate change going back to 1980. The only comfort that I draw from that graph is that it gives me an excuse not to keep up with the literature. So we can keep collecting data and making complicated graphs and putting them in big reports, but unfortunately, we also know now, to our detriment, that more information does not necessarily mean more understanding. Furthermore, we also know that more understanding does not necessarily mean more action. So we need to do other things as well. We need to continually search for narratives that are meaningful for people and their everyday lives and for the people that they care about. We're very fond of showing pictures like this, and it will give you a little twinge of momentary sadness about the fate of polar bears. But you know, unless you live in Churchill, Manitoba, polar bears are not part of your everyday life. So I've been thinking for years about how to make science and data more meaningful to people who are not scientists like me. So bear with me for one more graph. One of my climate change colleagues jokes that every climate change communicator has one favourite scary graph, and it's really true, and this one's my one, and I've been showing it for years. Because for me, it shows past, present and future. The little wiggly black line is the climate change we've had so far. The blue band is the climate change we could have if we meet the Paris Climate Agreement, and the red band is if we don't. And it, to me, is a stunning graph, but I understand that whenever I show it, about half the audience, their eyes just glaze over because it's a graph. So a few years ago, I experimented with trying to show it in a different way, and I put myself on that graph. I was born in the 60s, and if I live till I'm 85, then that line represents the average temperature increase that I will see over my lifetime. Doesn't look too bad. I have two children. They were born in the mid-90s. If they live till they're 85, that's the average temperature that they will experience over their lifetime on the present emissions trajectory. Now, I don't have grandchildren yet, but if I can assume that my kids might have kids when they're, say, about 30, and that my grandkids live into till they're 85, well, that's their lifespan and their temperature. Suddenly, 2100 doesn't seem so very far away. My grandkids will be dealing with, your grandkids, your great-grandkids will be dealing with a planet like we've never had before. Third thing I've learnt, this A word, advocacy. Scientists are often told that we shouldn't be advocates, as if it's sort of some sort of impure taint, something very, very bad. But you know, if you actually look up the word advocacy in the dictionary, it's got a pretty bland and neutral meaning. Public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. That doesn't sound too bad, does it? So I've really decided that advocacy is absolutely not a dirty word for a scientist, and indeed I will tell my scientist colleagues whenever they listen to me that if you accept the science of climate change, you could not possibly be, in all good conscience, anything other than an advocate of good science-based policy. Okay, fourth thing, coming back to that tightrope. We do need to balance all the negative stuff with some positive stuff as well to give people hope, because without hope, we give up, and if we give up, we really are screwed. Here's just one little hopeful thing that popped up last November. California, absolutely leading the way, started by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who knew, the governator. California had a target to get to 50% renewables by 2030. Well, they've beaten that by 10 years. They're now saying they will get to 50% renewables by 2020. Even more remarkable, and I don't have a slide on this, the ACT is on track for getting to 100% renewables by 2020. Now, the ACT is only a small place, obviously, but you know, if they can do it, why can't everywhere do it? Well done. Thank you, ACT, absolutely leading the way. And then finally, we simply cannot be effective alone. It's not just down to the scientists, but it's also not just down to the politicians or the business people or any other segment of our community. We need everybody working together. So I want to leave you now with just a couple of what I think are very positive images. This is some images from the People's Climate Marches in 2015. The one over there on your right is New York. Over 300,000 people marched in New York. The one at the top is Sydney. 50,000 people marched in Sydney. I should have looked up the figures for Melbourne, but I think it was around about that as well. There was nearly 800,000 people that marched before the Paris climate talks globally. People came together, and my second last slide is my favourite placard from those marches. We are the ones we've been waiting for. To me, this absolutely sums up the fact that saving this planet is not just the responsibility of the scientists or the politicians or the business people or indeed the women. It's actually all of our responsibility because after all, we are all on this planet together. Thank you very much.